They say the quietest women in the room are the ones who have already decided. Not the ones who are thinking about it. Not the ones who are afraid. The ones who have made their peace, drawn their line, and are simply waiting for the right moment to walk across it. Petra Voss looked like that kind of quiet. She always had. Her colleagues at the architectural firm where she worked as a senior structural engineer called her the steady one. Her mother-in-law called her sensible. Her husband Callum, no, not Callum, his name was Garrett. Garrett Whitmore called her boring. He didn't say it outright, of course. Men like Garrett rarely do. He said it in the way he stopped asking about her day. The way he left the room when she started talking about her work on the Lakeview Transit Hub. The way he introduced her at parties as just Petra, with a small dismissive wave of his hand, as if she were a footnote in a story he was still writing about himself. Petra was 31 years old. She had a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Toronto, a red cedar bookshelf she had built herself in the garage, and 7 years of a marriage she had spent quietly outgrowing like a coat that no longer fit across the shoulders. She found out about Sienna on a Thursday. Not because Garrett was careless. He was actually meticulous in his deception, deleting texts, clearing browser history, paying for hotel rooms in cash like a man who had watched too many crime dramas. He thought he was untouchable. But Petra was an engineer. She solved load-bearing problems for a living. And the problem with Garrett was that he forgot she had access to the shared cloud account they had set up 4 years ago to back up their phones during a camping trip in Algonquin. He never disconnected it. He assumed she wouldn't think to look. She wasn't looking, actually. She had been trying to find a photo of their dog, Chester, from a hike they did in 2019. She found Chester. She also found 47 photos of a woman named Sienna Greer, age 24, a junior associate at Garrett's real estate development company. Petra sat at the kitchen table for a very long time with her mug of tea going cold in front of her. She didn't cry. She didn't throw anything. She felt a sensation she would later describe to her sister as the floor dropping out, but in slow motion, so you have time to grab the doorframe. She put her phone face down on the table. She drank the cold tea. She looked at Chester, who was asleep on the mat near the back door, one paw twitching in a dream. Then she picked up her phone again and called her friend Leonora. No. She called her friend Wren. No. She called her friend Darcy. Darcy Holt, who was a family lawyer in Oakville and the only person in Petra's life who would not, under any circumstances, tell her to think about what she had to lose. I found photos, Petra said when Darcy picked up. There was a silence on the other end. Then, very carefully, how many? 47. Another silence. Okay, Darcy said, don't touch anything, don't move anything, don't tell him. Come over on Saturday and we'll talk. Petra did not go over on Saturday. She went over the next morning and the morning after that and the 3 mornings after that. By the end of the week, she and Darcy had built something together. Not a plan, exactly. More like an architecture. A structure designed to bear weight. Because Petra Voss did not simply want to leave Garrett Whitmore. She wanted to leave correctly. It had taken her 2.5 years to fully understand what she was dealing with. Garrett was not just a cheating husband. He was a pattern. He was the kind of man who used charm as a tool and vulnerability as leverage. When they fought, he made her feel irrational. When she cried, he called her dramatic. When she succeeded at work, he found a way to redirect the conversation to himself within 4 minutes. She had started timing it. The house they lived in, a detached Victorian on a tree-lined street in Hamilton, had been purchased using a down payment from Petra's inheritance. Money left by her grandmother, a seamstress from Sudbury, who had spent 50 years saving every spare dollar into a tin box under the floorboards. The house was in both their names. The mortgage was in Petra's name alone, because Garrett's credit had been in a complicated place when they bought it. His company, Whitmore Developments, had been partially seeded with a $50,000 loan from Petra's parents, documented as a personal loan, never repaid, never discussed again. The car he drove, a black Audi Q5, had been a joint purchase that Petra alone made the payments on, because Garrett's cash flow was seasonal. Petra was the foundation, Garrett was the facade. And she had finally stopped pretending she couldn't see the difference. Darcy explained the options methodically, the way a contractor explains a renovation scope. Separation agreement. Equitable distribution. The loan from Petra's parents could be documented as a matrimonial debt. The house, given the down payment source and sole mortgage liability, had strong grounds for primary claim. He's going to fight it, Darcy said during one of their kitchen table sessions, wrapping both hands around a mug of coffee. I know, Petra said. He's going to call you vindictive. He's going to tell people you're unstable. I know. Are you ready for that? Petra looked out the window at the backyard, where Chester was chasing a squirrel along the fence line with absolute conviction and zero chance of success. "I've been ready," she said, "for longer than I realized." She spent the next 4 months doing what she did best. She engineered, she did not change. She made Garrett his coffee in the morning. She sat next to him at his colleague's dinner party and laughed at the right moments. She asked him about the Bayview project and listened to him explain it as if she were hearing it for the first time. Though she had been the one to help him structure the investor pitch 2 years ago, she smiled at Sienna when Sienna attended the company's summer function, and Garrett introduced her as one of our rising stars, with a particular warmth that was not professional. Petra smiled and shook Sienna's hand and said it was lovely to meet her. She meant it, actually. None of what was coming was Sienna's fault. Sienna was 24 and believed what she'd been told. In the meantime, Petra was quietly assembling. She moved her personal savings, money she had been directing into a separate account since the day Darcy told her to, into a trust. She photographed every piece of furniture she had purchased or inherited. She had her grandmother's ring, her cedar bookshelf, and the original down payment wire transfer records. She contacted the lender about the mortgage. She spoke to her parents, who were quiet for a long time and then said, "We always wondered when you'd see it." She made arrangements for Chester. And then, on the last Friday of September, Garrett announced over dinner that he was heading to a conference in Whistler for the weekend. A real estate summit. Very important for the Bayview deal. He'd be back Sunday night. Petra nodded and said to drive safe. She watched his taillights disappear down the street. She went inside. She called her brother Fraser. Fraser was 6'2", calm in emergencies, and owned a moving truck through his renovation company. "Saturday," she said, 6 a.m. "I'll be there," Fraser said. She called her mother. She called Darcy. She called the property manager at a furnished apartment in Burlington. She had quietly rented 3 weeks prior. Then she sat on the kitchen floor with Chester, and scratched behind his ears for a long time, until the weight of the last 7 years felt bearable enough to stand up and start packing. The moving truck arrived at 6:03 in the morning, just as the neighborhood was beginning to turn gray with early light. Fraser brought 2 of his crew, quiet, efficient men who did not ask questions and worked without commentary. Petra had color-coded the boxes 3 weeks in advance. The system was so clean that they were done by noon. The items she left: Garrett's clothing, his golf equipment, his collection of business books arranged by spine color on the living room shelves, the espresso machine he had chosen, the sectional sofa he had picked without consulting her, and a single envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside the envelope was a letter, not angry, not long, 3 paragraphs. The first explained that she had left and would not be returning. The second explained that Darcy Holt would be in touch regarding the separation agreement, and that the house would need to be addressed given the documented financing history. The third said simply that she wished him well and hoped he would one day be honest. If not with her, then at least with himself. She did not mention Sienna. She did not need to. She also left, clipped to the top of the envelope, a single printed photograph. It was from the cloud backup. Garrett and Sienna on a dock somewhere in Muskoka, his arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing. It was dated the weekend he had told Petra he was in Calgary for a site inspection. She left the front door behind her. She gave the spare key to Fraser. She drove to Burlington with Chester asleep on the passenger seat. Garrett arrived home Sunday night. Petra knew what happened from the timestamps. He called her at 9:47 p.m. She didn't answer. He called again at 9:52, 9:58, 10:04, and then in a cluster of 7 calls between 10:10 and 10:21. She watched the notifications appear on her phone with the focused detachment of a doctor reading test results. At 10:34, a text. "What the hell is this, Petra? Call me." At 10:41, "Where are you? Are you serious right now?" At 11:02, "I can explain the photo. It's not what it looks like. Please just call me." At 11:19, "Petra." She turned the phone face down and made herself a cup of chamomile tea. She sat by the window of the furnished apartment and watched the lights on the Burlington waterfront. Chester was already asleep on the rug she had brought from the old house. The good one, the Persian that had belonged to her grandmother. She felt a phantom ache in her chest. Not grief for Garrett, exactly. Grief for the version of the marriage she had believed in for the first 2 years, before the cracks became undeniable. Grief for the house which she had loved independently of him. Grief for the idea of things. But not enough to pick up the phone. Garrett called Darcy's office Monday morning. Darcy had been expecting it. He was very loud. Darcy told Petra afterward, with the clinical amusement of someone who has heard every version of this particular speech. "He said you had taken things that weren't yours. He said you'd ambushed him. He asked if you knew what you were throwing away. What did you say? Petra asked. I said I'd forward him the separation agreement and that further communication should be directed to me in writing. And then? He hung up, and then called back 3 minutes later to ask for your address. I hope you didn't give it to him, Petra. Darcy's voice was gently reproachful. What kind of lawyer do you think I am? What followed was 6 weeks of the particular quiet chaos that precedes a divorce when one party expected it and the other did not. Garrett retained a lawyer, a man named Sullivan, known locally for being aggressive and expensive. Sullivan sent a letter contesting the primary claim on the house. Darcy sent back the wire transfer records, the mortgage documents, the original loan paperwork from Petra's parents, and a quiet, devastating paragraph about equitable contribution. Garrett called Petra's mother. Her mother, to her eternal credit, listened politely for 4 minutes and then said, Garrett, I'm going to stop you there. We lent you $50,000. If you'd like to discuss the house, speak to Darcy. Garrett called Petra's colleague Marielle, who worked at the same firm, and implied that Petra had been emotionally unstable for years. Marielle called Petra afterward. He called me to talk about you, Marielle said, clearly baffled. I told him I had a site meeting and hung up. He tried to freeze the joint account. Darcy had anticipated this and had already ensured Petra's direct deposits were rerouted 3 weeks prior. He called Sienna and told her he needed space to deal with a family crisis. This, Petra learned later, did not go well for Garrett. Sienna, it turned out, had believed the story about the dying marriage and the imminent divorce. She had believed she was the future. Learning that the plan had been significantly less formalized than advertised was a revelation she processed by removing Garrett from her phone and sending a brief, mortifying email to HR about a workplace relationship she believed should be on record. Garrett's HR department was not thrilled. Petra heard about all of this secondhand, gradually, the way you hear about weather that has already passed. She was not pleased by Garrett's suffering in any active way. She was simply no longer inside the storm. She had kept Chester. She had kept her grandmother's ring and her bookshelf and the Persian rug. She had kept her savings and her career and her sense of direction. What she had not kept, and did not know until the 4th week of negotiations, was something she had to sit down to absorb: the loan, the $50,000 her parents had given Garrett. She had assumed it would simply be documented as a marital debt, recovered through the separation. But when Darcy's team pulled the original paperwork, something emerged that neither Petra nor Darcy had anticipated. Garrett had incorporated a holding company 18 months after receiving the loan. He had transferred assets into it. The company was registered in the name of a numbered corporation. The loan from Petra's parents, technically made to Garrett personally, had been used as seed capital for a structure that was now, on paper, legally separate from him. He was planning, Petra said, very quietly when Darcy explained this. It looks like it, Darcy said, not necessarily for this specific outcome, but he was building a wall between himself and his debts. It's not uncommon. Petra was quiet for a moment. Can we get to it? It's going to be harder and slower, but yes. Darcy folded her hands on the table. Here's the thing though, the house is solid, the mortgage is yours, the down payment records are clean, we will get the house settled. The corporate structure, that's a longer fight. How long? Darcy looked at her. Are you willing to be patient? Petra thought about her grandmother, who had spent 50 years saving money in a tin box under the floorboards because she didn't trust banks and she believed with a seamstress's precision that every stitch counted. Yes, she said. The house was settled in Petra's favor 4 months after she left. Garrett was ordered to vacate within 60 days. He moved into a rental in Stony Creek and was photographed by a neighbor who posted it on a local Facebook group, loading his golf clubs into a borrowed pickup truck. Petra moved back in. She repainted the front hallway the color she had always wanted. A deep, warm ochre that Garrett had said was too much. She put her grandmother's photograph on the mantel. She planted a vegetable garden along the south fence, the one that got the afternoon sun she had been tracking for 3 years. Chester approved of the garden. He used it primarily as a place to sleep in patches of sunlight, disrupting the bean seedlings with a cheerful total absence of guilt. Work continued. The Lakeview Transit Hub was progressing through the design development phase, and Petra had been asked to lead the structural review for a new mixed-use development in Guelph. She stayed late some nights, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely liked the problem. She liked the feeling of weight distributed correctly. She liked knowing what held. She did not think much about Garrett. This surprised her actually. She had expected the absence of him to feel like a wound. Instead it felt like a room with better air. She thought occasionally about the $50,000. Not with rage, She was not built for sustained rage. With the steady patience of someone who knows a structure is still standing, even if the scaffolding isn't fully down yet. Darcy was working on it. These things moved slowly. And then came the phone call, on a Tuesday afternoon in February, while Petra was in the site office reviewing foundation load calculations for the Guelph project. It was Darcy's paralegal, a meticulous young man named Augustin, who spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone who had delivered a lot of news. "Miss Voss," he said. "Are you somewhere you can talk?" She set down her pencil. "Yes, the numbered corporation, we found a crack." The crack, it turned out, was not in the legal structure itself. It was in Garrett. In his effort to minimize his personal liability, Garrett had been very careful about separating himself from the holding company on paper. But he had been less careful in practice. Specifically, he had used his personal email to communicate with the company's sole other director, a man named Perry, a university friend who had agreed to be listed as co-director as a favor, without fully understanding the implications. Perry, it emerged, had recently become aware of those implications. He had also recently received a letter from the holding company's accountant, suggesting that certain transactions from 3 years ago might attract CRA attention if reviewed. Perry was not enthusiastic about CRA attention. Perry called a lawyer. Perry's lawyer called Darcy's office, and Perry, in exchange for being removed cleanly from the situation, agreed to provide documentation of the original capitalization of the company. Documentation that clearly showed the $50,000 transfer from Garrett's personal account following the receipt of the loan from Petra's parents. The thread was loose. Darcy pulled it. It took another 3 months, a mediation session in which Garrett arrived looking considerably less polished than he had at the company summer function 18 months ago, and a strongly worded assessment from Darcy about the probable outcome of proceeding to litigation. Garrett's lawyer, Sullivan, apparently reviewed the documentation from Perry and had a frank conversation with his client about realistic expectations. The settlement was reached on a Thursday. The $50,000, structured as a recovery of matrimonial debt with interest, was transferred to Petra's parents within 10 days. Petra's mother called when the transfer came through. She was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for her. Then she said, "Your grandmother would have liked this?" "The outcome?" Petra asked. "The way you handled it," her mother said. "Without screaming. Without making a mess." Petra looked out the kitchen window at the vegetable garden, which was just beginning to show the first stubborn green tips of late spring. Chester was lying in the dirt beside the bean seedlings, one paw over his nose. There was one more thing. Petra had not told anyone about it, not Darcy, not her mother, not Fraser. She had handled it herself quietly in the last week of March before the settlement was finalized. She had driven to the office of the architectural firm where Garrett's holding company owned a small commercial unit, a property investment that was part of the contested assets. The property was valued at $340,000. In the settlement, Garrett had negotiated to keep it, taking a reduced share of other assets in exchange. Petra had agreed to this without argument. What she had not mentioned was that she had already spent 6 weeks consulting with a commercial property broker named Issa, who had a client interested in the unit adjacent to Garrett's. The client was a franchisee looking to open a location of a very loud, very popular, very family-oriented play gym. The franchise went in 2 months after settlement. It opened on a Saturday with a grand opening event that involved a bouncy castle, a PA system, and approximately 200 children. Garrett's unit, which he had been leasing to a private physiotherapy practice that valued quiet, lost its tenant within 4 weeks. Petra did not know this for certain. She suspected it. She suspected it in the way you suspect a load-bearing calculation is right before the results come in, with quiet, grounded confidence. She was not a cruel person. She did not want Garrett to suffer in any lasting way. She simply understood, with the precision of someone who had spent a career thinking about foundations, that sometimes you don't need to demolish a structure. You just need to change the conditions around it. The last thing anyone expected was the email from Sienna Greer. It arrived in Petra's inbox on a Saturday morning in April, 11 months after she had left the Hamilton house. The subject line was, "I know you don't owe me anything." Petra stared at it for a long moment. Then she opened it. It was not long. Sienna wrote that she was not asking for absolution and was not trying to excuse what she had been part of. She wrote that she had believed what she had been told and had subsequently learned, in a series of painful conversations, how much of it had been constructed to serve Garrett's purposes. She wrote that she was not looking for a response. She just wanted Petra to know that she was sorry. The last line said, "I looked up your work. The Lakeview Hub design is extraordinary. You're very good at what you do." Petra read it twice. She closed her laptop and took Chester for a long walk along the escarpment trail, in the particular sharp gold light that only comes in Ontario in early spring, when the cold is retreating but hasn't quite conceded. The lake was still steel gray below them. The air smelled of pine resin and thaw. She thought about whether to respond. She thought about what her grandmother would have said. Her grandmother had been a woman of few words and long memory, and she had believed, in the way of someone who had survived genuine scarcity, that grudges were a luxury you could not afford. They cost too much to carry. That evening, Petra sat down at her kitchen table. She opened her laptop. She typed a short reply. "Thank you for writing. I hope you're well." She pressed send. She closed the laptop. She made dinner. She put on a record, an old Joni Mitchell album she had found at a garage sale in Dundas, and stood in her ochre-colored hallway listening to it. Chester came and sat on her feet in the way he did when he sensed she was thinking. Outside, the street was quiet. The vegetable garden was dark and waiting. The house held its warmth around her like a thing that had always been hers. There is a particular kind of strength that doesn't look like strength from the outside. It doesn't raise its voice, it doesn't perform. It just keeps measuring and calculating and waiting for the moment when the conditions are exactly right, and then it moves. Petra Voss had spent 7 years being called sensible and steady and boring. She had let people say it. She had not argued. She understood now that the people who called her boring were simply not paying close enough attention. She was an engineer. She had always known that the most important work happens below the surface, in the parts no one sees, in the foundations that hold everything else up. She had built herself a good one,